Jimmy Martins didn't just sweep floors, he kept memories alive. When he turned a dusty case into a home for lost items, he didn't expect anyone to notice. But when the school tried to take it down, they learned just how much had been found there. What started as forgotten items became something no one wanted to lose. If stories about quiet heroes, hidden hearts, and the power of memory move you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What you're about to see might just stay with you. The keys spoke first. Mr. Jimmy Martins discovered them on a Tuesday morning, scattered beneath the water fountain like fallen stars. 3 house keys, 1 car key, and something that might have unlocked a diary or a jewelry box. They clinked softly in his weathered palm as he turned them over, wondering about the stories they carried. At 64, Jimmy had been Lincoln Elementary's janitor for 12 years. His hands had mopped 1,000 spills. His eyes had seen countless tears dried and friendships born in these hallways. But the keys felt different. They felt like secrets waiting to be told. The standard protocol was simple. Toss lost items into the cardboard box behind the main office desk, where they'd sit for 30 days before finding their way to the donation pile. But something about these keys made Jimmy pause. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the brass. Or maybe it was the small rubber duck keychain attached to the smallest one, clearly loved, clearly missed. Instead of walking to the office, Jimmy found himself standing before the old glass display case outside the library. It had been empty for months, ever since the last book fair. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced inside the case like tiny ghosts. Jimmy opened the case and placed the keys on the middle shelf. Then he did something he'd never done before. He wrote a note. His handwriting was careful, deliberate. Found near the water fountain, waiting for their person to come home. The next morning, a second grader named Tommy squealed with delight and claimed the keys with the rubber duck. His mother had been frantically searching for them all week, but Jimmy barely noticed Tommy's joy. He was too busy staring at what had appeared overnight in the case, a small, forgotten pencil eraser shaped like a hamburger and a hair tie with rainbow beads. By Thursday, the case held a collection of tiny treasures. A mechanical pencil with a cartoon character grip, a friendship bracelet with loose threads, a small toy dinosaur is missing one leg. Jimmy found himself crafting little stories for each one. This brave T-Rex fought many battles. Someone's hair looked beautiful in rainbow colors. This pencil helped write important things. The children began to notice. They would pause on their way to the library, pressing their faces against the glass, whispering theories about who might have lost what. Mrs. Moore, the librarian, mentioned that circulation had increased. Kids were lingering, creating stories about the objects, imagining the lives they'd lived. And then Maya arrived. She was 7 years old with serious brown eyes and pigtails that never quite stayed even. Maya had moved with her aunt after her grandmother's passing. She was the kind of child who ate lunch alone, not because she was unfriendly, but because she carried a weight that made other children instinctively step back. Maya appeared at the case on a Friday afternoon, long after the other children had boarded their buses. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, just watching the tiny museum Jimmy had accidentally created. Then, very carefully, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small silver locket. The paper was a drawing, a stick figure grandmother with gray curls and a wide smile, holding hands with a smaller figure. At the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, "I miss you, Grandma. I hope you can see my good grades." Maya opened the case. Jimmy had never bothered to lock it and placed her drawing next to the dinosaur. The locket went beside it. She stood there for another moment, whispered something too quiet to hear, and walked away. Jimmy found her offering the next morning. He held the drawing for a long time, reading the words over and over. Something shifted in his chest. This wasn't about lost things anymore. This was about the found ones. He was still standing there when Maya appeared beside him, quiet as a shadow. She looked up at him with those serious brown eyes, then at her drawing in his weathered hands. "Are you going to throw it away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy knelt until they were eye level. "Would you like me to throw it away?" Maya shook her head quickly. I want her to see it, but I don't know where she is now. The hallway was empty except for the two of them, morning light streaming through the tall windows. Jimmy had cleaned these floors for 12 years, but he'd never had a conversation quite like this one. Can I tell you something about grandmothers? He asked gently. Maya nodded. They have a special way of seeing things, even when we can't see them. My grandmother used to say that love doesn't need eyes to find what matters. Maya considered this seriously. Do you think she knows about my good grades? I think, Jimmy said, carefully placing the drawing back in the case, that she's very proud of you. And I think she'd want other kids to know it's okay to miss people we love. Maya watched as he positioned her drawing next to the brave T-Rex, her small fingers pressed against the glass. Mr. Jimmy, will you make sure nobody moves it? I promise, he said, and something in his voice made Maya believe him completely. She stood there for a second, holding eye contact. Thank you for keeping her safe. Jimmy stood in the empty hallway long after Maya had disappeared around the corner, understanding for the first time that he wasn't just keeping objects safe. He was protecting fragments of love that children were brave enough to share. He left Maya's drawing exactly where she'd placed it. Word traveled the way it does in elementary schools, whispered in lunch lines, shared during recess, carried home in backpacks full of crumpled papers and forgotten permission slips. Jimmy hadn't meant to call it anything. At first, it was just a shelf with lonely objects. But after placing the 5th or 6th item, he found himself standing there longer, thinking not about the things, but the people behind them. A missing glove, a key with no lock, a plastic bracelet someone must have treasured. That weekend, he scribbled a small card and taped it to the case, lost and found. But the next morning, someone had added a word in crayon, lost and found museum. He left it there, because that's what it was becoming, not just a place to claim what was lost, but to remember that every forgotten thing once mattered to someone. 3rd grader David left a dried flower he'd pressed between the pages of his math book. From my mom's garden before she got sick, read his note. 5th grader Amy contributed a broken watch that had belonged to her grandfather. It stopped working when he died, she wrote, but I still hear it ticking sometimes. Jimmy found himself arriving earlier each morning, not just to unlock the school, but to tend to the case. He dusted the glass, arranged the items with care, and added his own gentle labels. He bought a small notebook and began keeping track of each contribution, not for inventory, but for memory. The museum was becoming something he'd never intended, something larger than lost keys and forgotten erasers. It was becoming a place where children felt safe to leave pieces of their hearts. But not everyone saw it that way. Principal Eric Morrison was a practical man who believed in order, efficiency, and educational outcomes. He'd been at Lincoln for 2 years, and in that time, he'd increased test scores by 12% and reduced disciplinary incidents by 30%. He saw childhood education as an equation to be solved. On a Tuesday morning in October, Eric stood before the display case with his arms crossed and his jaw set. The case now held dozens of items, photographs, letters, small toys, pieces of jewelry, rocks painted with messages, origami flowers that had never been forgotten because they'd never been lost. This has to go, Eric told Jimmy, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made the decision before the conversation began. It's becoming a distraction. Kids are gathering here instead of going to class. Parents are asking questions. Jimmy's hands stilled on his dust cloth. Questions? The Wilson family thinks it's morbid. Mrs. Garrett says her son has been having nightmares about losing things since he started visiting this collection. And frankly, Jimmy, it's not appropriate to have children sharing personal family matters in a public display. The words hit Jimmy like small stones. He'd been so focused on the children who found comfort in the museum that he hadn't considered those who might find fear. I could add some guidelines, he offered quietly. Maybe limit what? The answer is no. Eric's tone was final. I need you to clear it out by Friday. Put everything back in the regular lost and found, and let's return to normal procedures. That afternoon, Jimmy sat alone in the custodial closet that doubled as his office. The space smelled of industrial cleaners and floor wax, familiar scents that usually comforted him. Now they felt suffocating. Maybe Eric was right. Maybe he'd overstepped. He was a janitor, not a counselor or a teacher. His job was to keep the school clean and safe, not to create makeshift therapy sessions in empty display cases. The practical part of his mind whispered that early retirement wasn't such a bad idea. His pension was decent, and his sister in Phoenix had been asking him to visit for months. But when he walked past the case that evening, he saw Maya there again. She was reading the other children's contributions, her lips moving silently as she sounded out the harder words. She'd added something new, a small piece of paper with a single word written in purple crayon. Thanks. Jimmy stood in the hallway long after Maya had gone home, staring at that one word until the automatic lights shut off around him. The next morning brought angry phone calls to the main office, parents who'd heard about the pending closure and had opinions about it. Some supported Eric's decision, worried about their children being exposed to sadness at such a young age. Others argued that the museum was helping their kids process difficult emotions they'd been carrying alone. Jimmy listened to the debates through the thin walls of the main office while he cleaned the adjoining conference room. He heard his name mentioned repeatedly, always followed by words like inappropriate or well-meaning, but misguided, or overstepping boundaries. He spent that evening at his kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. With careful, steady hands, he wrote a resignation letter that felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just about stepping away from the job. It felt like stepping away from something unspoken, something he had built, even if no one had asked him to. The next morning, he folded the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket, planning to leave it on the principal's desk after his shift. But he never made it that far. Miss Sullivan found it first, behind the wastebasket in the art room. Jimmy must have dropped it while emptying the bins, too distracted to notice. She caught up to him in the hallway, her voice light but firm. "Mr. Jimmy, you dropped something." She was younger than most of the staff, not long out of school herself, with streaks of paint on her fingers and that spark teachers have when they believe in what they do. She held out the letter, brow furrowed, eyes searching his face. "You're really leaving?" she asked quietly. Jimmy didn't answer right away, just took the paper from her hands and looked away. Miss Sullivan wasn't in charge. She wasn't senior faculty or administration. But she'd seen what the case had become. She'd watched her students linger in front of it between classes, read the notes aloud like sacred stories, add their own offerings without being asked. And in that moment, she understood. The glass case wasn't just shelves. It was a memory. It was care. It was a community. And Jimmy, he was the one holding it all together. But Miss Sullivan had kind eyes and the observational skills. That came from watching children express themselves through art every day. She saw the way Jimmy's shoulders had rounded, the way his usual smile had dimmed over the past week. "Mr. Jimmy," she said carefully, "are you okay?" The question was simple, but it opened something in Jimmy that had been locked tight for days. He found himself telling her about the museum, about Eric's decision, about the parents' concerns, and his own doubts. He talked about Maya's drawing and David's flower and Amy's broken watch, and how he'd somehow become the keeper of children's secrets without meaning to. Miss Sullivan listened without interrupting, nodding at the right moments, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "You know," she said when he'd finished, "art is just another way of telling stories, and memory is just another form of art." She invited him to stay after school that day, to see what her fourth graders were working on. Their current project was Objects That Matter. Each student had brought in something meaningful and was creating a piece that told its story. There was Marcus, painting a portrait of his military father's dog tags. Jessica is sculpting a clay version of her grandmother's thimble. Alex, writing a poem about a seashell he'd found on his only trip to the ocean. "They need to tell these stories," Miss Sullivan explained as they watched the children work. "And they need to know that someone is listening. What you created wasn't just a display case, Mr. Jimmy. It was a place where their stories mattered." That evening, Miss Sullivan spoke to her classes about the museum. She told them about the power of collective memory, about how communities are built on shared stories, about the difference between losing something and choosing to share it. Her students understood immediately. The next morning, Jimmy arrived to find something extraordinary. The hallway outside the library was covered in sticky notes, dozens of them, in every color imaginable. Each one carried a message. The museum made me feel less weird about missing my old house. Thank you for keeping our stories safe. It's okay to be sad sometimes. Please don't take it away. You make our school feel like home. Jimmy stood in the hallway reading every single note, his resignation letter forgotten in his pocket. Miss Sullivan appeared beside him, coffee cup in hand, smile knowing. Art tells stories, she said quietly. So does memory, and sometimes, so does a janitor with a good heart. That afternoon, the fourth graders organized themselves. They created official signs for the museum, the Lost Keys Club, stories worth sharing. And not just lost, remembered. They wrote explanations for visitors, guidelines for contributions, and even designed a special box for items that needed to be returned to their owners versus those that were meant to be shared. Maya appeared at Jimmy's elbow as he watched the older students work. She tugged on his sleeve and whispered, "Are you going to keep it?" Jimmy looked down at her serious brown eyes, then back at the case that had somehow become the heart of something larger than he'd ever imagined. "What do you think I should do?" Maya considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "I think," she said carefully, "that Grandma would want other kids to know it's okay to miss people." That evening, Jimmy tore up his resignation letter. The next morning, he found Maya at the case again, this time with a small group of first graders. She was pointing to different items, telling their stories in her serious, careful way. "This T-Rex was very brave," she was saying, "and this flower came from someone's mom's garden. And this," she pointed to her own drawing, "is my grandma. She lives in my heart now." Jimmy approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but Maya saw him and smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived at Lincoln. "Mr. Jimmy," she said, "I told them what you said about grandmothers having special ways of seeing. Jenny thinks her grandpa might be able to see her loose tooth." A gap-toothed girl named Jenny nodded enthusiastically. "He always gave me quarters for teeth. Maybe he still can, even if I can't see him." "Maybe he can," Jimmy agreed solemnly. "Love finds ways to keep working, even when we can't see how." As the children scattered to their classrooms, Maya lingered. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small folded paper. "I wrote her another letter," Maya said, "but this one's different. This one says thank you for sending me to a school where people understand about missing." She placed the letter carefully next to her drawing, then looked up at Jimmy with those wise brown eyes. "You understand about missing, too, don't you, Mr. Jimmy?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about his own grandmother, gone 30 years now, who had taught him that small kindnesses could change everything. He thought about all the children who had moved away, all the colleagues who had retired, all the pieces of his own heart he'd learned to carry quietly. "Yes," he said simply, "I understand about missing." Maya nodded as if this explained everything. "That's why you're so good at keeping things safe." She walked toward her classroom, but paused at the corner. "Mr. Jimmy, when I grow up, I want to be a keeper too." "You already are," he called after her. "You already are." Friday morning came with unprecedented energy. Jimmy arrived at school to find a line of children waiting by the museum case, not to gawk or whisper, but to contribute and to read. Miss Sullivan had clearly been busy. There were small easels set up nearby with poster boards explaining the difference between lost items, which would be returned to their owners, and shared items, which were gifts to the community's memory. The morning brought Principal Eric storming down the hallway, prepared to oversee the museum's dismantling. Instead, he found something that stopped him cold: organization, purpose, and most surprisingly, learning. Fourth grader Ashley was reading Maya's note to a group of first graders, helping them sound out the harder words. Sixth grader James was explaining the historical significance of his great-grandfather's pocket watch to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Moore had set up a small reading corner nearby, with books about memory, family, and friendship. The chaos Eric had feared wasn't there. Instead, there was something that looked suspiciously like education happening organically in his hallway. "What is this?" he asked Miss Sullivan, who was helping a second grader write a description for a small ceramic elephant. "A learning opportunity," she replied simply. The children are practicing writing, reading, research skills, empathy, and public speaking. Yesterday, Marcus spent 2 hours in the library looking up information about military medals because he wanted to properly explain his father's Purple Heart. Eric watched Marcus presenting his research to a captivated audience of younger children, his stutter barely noticeable as he talked about something that mattered to him. He saw quiet kids finding their voices, shy kids making connections, and sad kids finding comfort in shared experiences. "This wasn't what I expected," Eric admitted quietly. Miss Sullivan smiled. "The best education rarely is." That afternoon, Eric found Jimmy in the main hallway, carefully cleaning the glass case while children gathered around him like planets around the sun. A second grader was asking about proper care for old photographs. A fifth grader was discussing the difference between brass and gold. Maya was showing a kindergartner how to write neatly on the small cards. "Mr. Jimmy," Eric said, and the children immediately went quiet, sensing adult business. "Could I speak with you privately?" Jimmy's heart sank, but he followed Eric to the empty classroom across the hall. He prepared himself for the final directive, the non-negotiable order to dismantle what had become so precious to so many. Instead, Eric said, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and heavy with meaning. "I was wrong," Eric continued. "I saw potential problems instead of actual solutions. I saw disruption instead of engagement, and I underestimated both you and the children." He walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard where more children were gathering, comparing notes and sharing stories. "The test scores are important," Eric said, "but so is this. So is helping children feel seen and heard and valued. I've been watching them all week, and I've never seen engagement like this. They're writing more, reading more, researching more, because it matters to them." Jimmy waited, not daring to hope. What if we made this official? A school-wide project, memory walls in every hallway, rotating themes, and proper documentation. And what if you let it? The words took a moment to sink in. "Me, you," Eric confirmed. "You understand something about creating safe spaces that I'm still learning. The children trust you. Their parents are starting to trust you. And frankly, you've created something here that I've never seen in 15 years of education." That evening, Jimmy called his sister in Phoenix instead of discussing retirement plans. He found himself describing memory, walls and sticky notes, and 7-year-old philosophers who understood that some things weren't lost, just waiting to be shared. The Lost Keys Club held its first official meeting the following Monday. 23 children showed up along with Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Moore, and to everyone's surprise, Principal Eric. They set rules, created a rotation for themes, and planned their first school-wide memory wall project. Maya, who'd started it all with a drawing and a whispered wish, was elected the club's first student president. 3 years later, the memory wall had become Lincoln Elementary's signature feature. Visitors came from other schools to see how stories could transform a building from an institution into a community. The original display case still stood outside the library, now joined by installations throughout the school. The first day Nerves wall helped new students feel less alone. Things I'm proud of in the cafeteria celebrated big and small wins. And in a quiet corner near the counselor's office, the People Who Matter Memorial honored loved ones, from grandparents to pets, who still lived in children's hearts. Jimmy's title had changed to Community Memory Coordinator, though most students simply called him the Keeper. His janitorial duties were reduced to make space for his new role, training other schools, presenting at conferences, and helping students build spaces where emotions and learning could live side by side. He even had an office just down the hall from Principal Eric. The program showed measurable results, increased writing scores, better attendance, fewer counseling referrals. But it was the unseen impact that mattered to Jimmy, the shy child who found her voice, the grieving one who felt less alone, the angry one who discovered his feelings had a place. Maya, now 10 and in 4th grade, still visited the original case. She'd added a photo from her first sleepover, a flower from her aunt's wedding, a trophy from the spelling bee she won by Spelling Remembrance. But her grandmother's drawing stayed front and center, surrounded by dozens of other tributes. The Lost Keys Club had grown, too. What began as an accidental collection became a structured program with chapters in 12 schools. Students learned to interview elders, document stories, and build digital archives of their neighborhoods. But at its core, nothing had changed. Every person carries stories worth sharing, and community is built one memory at a time. One Tuesday in November, Jimmy noticed something new in the case. A small envelope. His name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter. "Dear Mr. Jimmy, you probably don't remember me, but I was in Mrs. Moore's second grade class when you started the museum. I left a small stuffed rabbit after my parents' divorce, so other kids would know it was okay to feel scared sometimes. I'm in high school now. I still remember how safe you made me feel. I'm student body president, and we're starting our own version of the memory wall. We're calling it Stories That Shape Us. Thank you for teaching me that what we carry in our hearts isn't a burden. It's a treasure waiting to be shared." David Nicholas, formerly known as the kid with the stuffed rabbit. Jimmy sat in the hallway, reading the letter twice, then a third time, outside the window. Kids arrived for another day, backpacks full of books, snacks, and stories they might choose to tell. The keys that started it all were long gone, returned or passed on. But what they unlocked remained. The quiet truth that every person, child or adult, student or janitor, carries something worth remembering. As the morning bell rang and laughter filled the halls, Jimmy stood and straightened his shoulders. There were new stories to keep, new memories waiting for a home, new keys to connection. And in the case behind him, Maya's drawing of her grandmother still smiled, patient and eternal, waiting for the next child. Who needed to know that love doesn't end when people leave? It simply finds new ways to be shared. Some things, Jimmy had learned, aren't really lost. They're just waiting for the right person to help them find their way home. In a noisy world, it's the quiet acts of care that echo the longest. Don't forget, everyday heroes are all around us.